Hello and welcome to this lesson in which first we'll be learning how to create gradient brushes in Illustrator, and then we'll switch to Photoshop so you can see the possibilities of using blur. I'm here in subboard number 6 in Pinterest, where I pinned some works where various types of blur are used. There are a large variety of blur filters in Photoshop, and understanding them all and get the most of them requires us to invest some time to know them and tweak their parameters. Nonetheless, on a personal note, I have a weakness for filter-based gradients. I think if you are patient enough with them, you can get exquisite taste creations like the ones in here. In this lesson, I'd like to give you the keys of all blur filters and a correct guide of how to use each of them. But I'm afraid in this case I'll only be able to present them superficially, and you'll have to do the task of playing with all of them. Because the ways to use them and the results you could get are endless. Well, let's get into work then. I have Illustrator open and my workspace ready, in which this time I've switched the Gradients panel we've always had in previous posters for the Brushes panel. If you ever worked with brushes, you'll know you can create custom brushes for your works. And though when creating them, Illustrator doesn't let us use elements containing a gradient, there are two workarounds to this limitation. Let's take a look. I'm going to start by drawing a circle with the L key and apply a random gradient. If I wanted to create a brush out of this element, I just have to select it and drag it to the brush panel. In the window that pops up, we'd have to select Art Brush. But as I already predicted, Illustrator responds with an error message because it doesn't admit elements with a gradient. So what we're going to do is expand that gradient, or in other words, we're going to convert it to a bunch of little objects, so each of them will have a flat color, but altogether will give a sense of gradient. We'll do this in the Object menu, Expand. This window will pop up, in which we have the option to specify how many little pieces the object will be broken into. I'll leave it on the default values. If we try again to drag our element into the brush panel and select Art Brush, we'll see this time it does create the brush. And besides, we can see it appears in the Brushes panel. If I wanted to draw with it, I just have to select the brush tool and make sure I have selected the brush I want to use in the Brushes panel. Another workaround for creating gradient brushes is using the Blend tool. And this is the way we'll create a brush in order to use it in our poster number 6. I'm going to start by creating a circle and duplicating by holding Alt while dragging it. Now using Ctrl D, I'll repeat the procedure until I have 8 circles, and I'm going to use my palette to color them in pairs. And since I want the diameter of the stroke to decrease, I'll make each circle smaller than the previous one, though you can make yours straight or any way you like. In order to get this shape, I'm going to select these 7, right-click, transform, scale, and I scale them to 90%. I repeat the operation pressing Ctrl D, but this time selecting only these 6, and so on. Now I'm going to apply the Blend tool, which we can apply it, as you know, from the toolbar or from the Object menu. Adjust the blend steps if necessary. So with this, we'll create our brush. Now drag the blend to the brushes panel and select Art Brush. We'll leave the default parameters and click OK. Alright, so we can start drawing with it. If we want, we can adjust the size of the brush. This is the coolest part. Here we can go crazy experimenting with various shapes. If you prefer, you can draw with the pen and then apply the stroke with the brush. I'm going to do this by hand so it looks more spontaneous, and I'm going to try and draw a kind of careless spiral. Well, so after all these tests, I liked this shape. So I'm going to copy it using Ctrl-C and we'll switch to Photoshop. Here in Photoshop, I have my document ready with the template, and in the swatches panel, I imported the colors I used on the brush just in case they come in handy later. If I hit Ctrl-V, I'll be able to paste the shape I copied before in Illustrator. I'm going to paste it as a smart object so I can undo the changes I do easily, and I'm going to adjust the size to my taste. I'm going to hit Ctrl-V again in order to paste another copy, which I'll rotate and deform it so it doesn't look exactly as the other one. And I'm going to hide one of them. Now I'm going to experiment with blur filters. All the possibilities of blur we can find them inside the filter menu in the blur and blur gallery submenus. We're going to start with the blur submenu. The one you probably used before is Gaussian blur, which is the most common one. But when experimenting with gradients, there are other very interesting blurs. We're going to start, for example, by applying motion blur. We can adjust the distance as well as the angle towards which it applies the blur, and it results in this interesting effect. Let's turn off the motion effect from here, and I'm going to apply a different filter. In this case, a radial filter. Here we can choose if we want a spin blur, which would move in a circular fashion, or maybe a zoom type blur, by which the blur would expand radially outwards. In both cases, you can adjust the amount. The best way is for you to tweak the parameters and try with different filters. Since we're using smart objects, we can modify the parameters we've used anytime, double-clicking on a filter. We can also mix two filters and even adjust the amount of each one of them by modifying the opacity. Let's hide this layer and try out the blur gallery with this other one. If we get into the filter menu and use any blur from the blur gallery, it will automatically trigger this window. On the right, we can find all blur effects of the gallery. These filters have a regulator, and you can set various blur points and play with them. I suggest you toy around with all of them in order for you to check how each of them work and experiment as much as you can with them. You can also mix them up and even add down here a bit of grain. Once you have something you like, click OK to apply the changes. Since I prepared two layers with different blurs, I'm going to play around with blending modes and see what comes out of it. As you can see, this gradient technique is mainly based in playing and experimentation. And the base is knowing how to choose nice colors and the tools the application offers. I think it works fine like this. I'm going to group both layers in a folder pressing Ctrl G, and I'm going to adjust it to the size of my taste. Now, in order to give it a touch, I'm going to draw a sphere on top, which I'll fill with white, and I'll add an inner shadow from here. I choose the color, I adjust the parameters, and now I get a cutout effect. And in order to put the finishing touch to the poster, I'm going to put a bit of color in the background. To do this, I'm going to select a brush to which I'm going to increase the diameter and lower to 0 its hardness. And with a 50% opacity, I'll put some touches on the edges. So now the only thing left is to edit the template. I double click on it and it will open in Illustrator, where I'll be able to change the title and the number of the poster. And this would be our poster number 6. In the 7th and last poster, we'll continue in Photoshop in order to work with the gradient map tool.